Buddha times Heidegger. What happens when you really think about death? The Buddha once asked his monks a question, not a philosophical question, not a riddle, a question about how they lived. How do you practice the contemplation of death? One monk answered, "Lord, I contemplate that I might live for a day. In that day, I would attend to the Blessed One's teaching." Another said, "I might live for half a day." Another, "I might live for the time it takes to eat one meal." Another, "I might live for the time it takes to chew and swallow 4 morsels of food." The Buddha listened to all of them, and then he said something that changes everything about how you hear those answers. He said, "All of you are living heedlessly. All of you are practicing the contemplation of death, loosely." The monk who said, "1 day," heedless. "Half a day," heedless. "1 meal," heedless. Even the monk who said 4 morsels of food, heedless. The correct answer, the Buddha said, came from the monks who contemplated that they might die in the time between one breath and the next. Between this breath and the next one, which you are taking right now, there is a gap. And in that gap, everything you have ever been could end. That is not pessimism. That is not morbidity. That, the Buddha said, is the beginning of a life actually lived. 2,400 years later, in a tiny cabin in the Black Forest of Germany, a philosopher arrived at almost exactly the same conclusion, through an entirely different path. His name was Martin Heidegger. And his central claim was this: the way most of us relate to our own death is the single greatest lie we tell ourselves. And that lie shapes everything: how we work, what we chase, who we pretend to be, and what we never get around to saying. Tonight, we are going to sit with both of them, a monk and a philosopher, and ask one question: what actually happens when you stop running from the fact that you will die? They agree on the diagnosis, they agree on the urgency, but where they end up, that is where things get interesting. Because one of them says, face your death, and you will finally become who you really are. The other says, face your death, and you will see that there was never a separate you to begin with. Same cliff. 2 entirely different responses to the edge. But before we get there, before the disagreement, we need to start with what they both saw clearly. Something most people spend an entire lifetime not seeing. And it's this: you are, right now, almost certainly living as though you are not going to die. Not because you're stupid, not because you haven't thought about it, but because there is a machinery inside your mind, inside your culture, inside the very language you use, that is designed to keep you from feeling the full weight of your own mortality. Heidegger had a name for that machinery. The Buddha had a name for it too. And they described it so similarly, separated by 2.5 millennia, with no knowledge of each other, that when you place their words side by side, it feels like 2 doctors reading the same patient's chart. Let's read it. The disease. Everyone runs. Here is something you can test tonight. Pay attention to what happens when death comes up in conversation. Not your death, anyone's death. A colleague's parent, a news story, an acquaintance's diagnosis. Watch what happens to the room. Someone says, "Well, they lived a good life." Someone changes the subject. Someone makes a joke. And within 30 seconds, the conversation has moved on, as though death were a brief interruption in the real business of living, rather than the one thing that makes every other thing temporary. We don't say someone died. We say they passed away, lost their battle, are no longer with us, as though they've simply stepped into another room and might come back. Hospitals move the dying to separate floors. Funeral homes handle the body so the family doesn't have to. We have built entire systems, medical, linguistic, architectural, whose function is to ensure that death happens somewhere else, to someone else, at a time that is not now. Heidegger saw this, and he gave it a name that is deceptively simple. He called it das Man, the they. You have heard the phrase, one dies. In German, man stirbt. It's a common enough expression. Heidegger asked, who is this one? Who is the one that dies? His answer, nobody. That's the point. One dies means death happens. To the they, to the anonymous public, to people in general. But crucially, in no case is it I myself. Because this one, this they, is the nobody. That is not a grammar lesson. That is a diagnosis. Heidegger is saying that we have collectively constructed a way of talking about death, a way of relating to death, that lets every individual slip out the back door. Death is real. Death is acknowledged. Death is everywhere in the news. But my death? That remains somehow perpetually theoretical. The they, Heidegger wrote, does not permit the courage for anxiety in the face of death. And here is where it gets unsettling. Das Man is not some external force. It's not a conspiracy. It's not other people doing this to you. It is the mode of being you default to when you are not paying attention. It is the autopilot, the drift, the way you go through Tuesday without once registering that Tuesday could be the last one. 24 centuries before Heidegger wrote those words, the Buddha used a term that maps so precisely onto das Man that it's worth pausing to let it land. The Pali word is pamada, heedlessness, not ignorance. You know you will die. Not denial in the clinical sense. You've been to funerals. Heedlessness. A kind of living that proceeds as though the knowledge of death were decoration rather than foundation. You know, but you do not live as though you know. In the Dhammapada, verse 21, the Buddha says, heedfulness is the path to the deathless. Heedlessness is the path to death. The heedful do not die. The heedless are as if already dead. Read that again. The heedless are as if already dead. That is nearly word for word what Heidegger is saying about das Man. The one who says one dies is already not living, because a life unlived in the awareness of its own end is a life running on borrowed patterns, borrowed opinions, borrowed urgency. It is not your life. It is the they's life, and the they is nobody. Two thinkers, two traditions, one diagnosis. Most human beings are sleepwalking through the one experience that cannot be delegated, cannot be postponed, and cannot be undone. But the Buddha did not leave it at diagnosis. He prescribed. In a teaching meant not just for monks, but for everyone. Lay people, householders, people with families and jobs and ordinary Tuesday evenings. He laid out 5 things to contemplate every single day. 1. I am subject to aging. Aging is not something I can avoid. 2. I am subject to illness. Illness is not something I can avoid. 3. I am subject to death. Death is not something I can avoid. 4. I will grow different, separate from all that is dear and appealing to me. 5. I am the owner of my actions, heir to my actions. Whatever I do, for good or for evil, to that I will fall heir. 5 statements, no philosophy, no metaphysics, just 5 facts that every person on this planet shares, and that almost no one sits with willingly. The 4th one, I will grow different, separate from all that is dear and appealing to me. If you are over 50, if you have lost a parent, a partner, a friend whose voice you can still hear in your memory, you know that this is not abstract. This is the most concrete thing anyone has ever said. And notice the Buddha's framing. Each of these contemplations, he says, overcomes a specific intoxication. The contemplation of aging overcomes the intoxication with youth. The contemplation of illness overcomes the intoxication with health. And the contemplation of death overcomes what the Buddha calls jivita mada, the intoxication with life itself. The intoxication with life, not with pleasure, not with success. With life, with the sheer fact of being alive, which is so constant, so overwhelming, so ever-present, that you mistake it for something permanent. That intoxication, jivita mada, is pamada wearing its most beautiful mask. And it is precisely what Heidegger calls das Man, wearing its most comfortable clothes. In 1922, Elfriede Heidegger bought a small plot of land on a mountain above the village of Tottenauberg in the Black Forest of southern Germany. Her husband, Martin, 33 years old, not yet famous, not yet infamous, built a cabin there, 3 rooms, 6 meters by 7, no running water. He would go there for weeks at a time, alone. In winter, the snow buried the cabin past its windows. The nearest village was a long walk down the mountain. There was nothing to do but think. He wrote later, "On a deep winter's night, when a wild snowstorm rages around the cabin, that is the perfect time for philosophy." It was there, in that silence, in that cold, in that relentless proximity to a landscape that did not care whether he existed, that Heidegger wrote the pages that would become Being and Time, the book that asked, more rigorously than any book before it, what does it mean to be, when the being in question knows it will end? There is something almost monastic about the image. A man in a small room, stripped of distraction, facing something that the comfortable rooms of ordinary life are designed to obscure. The Buddha went to the forest. Heidegger went to the mountain. Both understood something that the comfortable rooms of ordinary life are designed to obscure. You cannot think clearly about what it means to be alive until you stop running from the fact that you will not always be. But what Heidegger found on that mountain, and what the Buddha found under the Bodhi tree, those are 2 very different things. Heidegger came down the mountain and said, "Own your death. Let it make you real." The Buddha stood up and said, "Look at who you think is dying, and see that there was never anyone there to own anything at all." That is the conversation, and it begins, as both of them insisted it must, with the thing you are most afraid to look at directly. Heidegger's answer, own your death. So far, we have 2 men who agree. They agree that most people live as if death belongs to someone else. They agree that this evasion is not a minor oversight. It is the central distortion of human life. And they agree that the only cure is direct confrontation. But here is where the path splits, because the question is not whether to face death. The question is, what do you find when you do? Heidegger's answer came first, in print at least. Published in 1927, Being and Time is one of the most difficult and most important books written in the 20th century. It is unfinished. The 3rd division was never written. It is dense in a way that borders on hostile. And buried inside it, in sections 46 through 53, is one of the most rigorous analyses of death ever attempted by a Western thinker. Let me try to make it livable. The first thing Heidegger does is take away the picture you have in your head. When you think about death, you almost certainly think about a moment, a final moment. The heart stops, the monitors flatline, someone pulls a sheet over the face. Death, in this picture, is something that happens at the end, the last scene in the film. Heidegger says that picture is wrong, and the fact that you carry it is part of how you stay asleep. He makes a distinction that sounds technical, but changes everything. There is Abelbon, demise, the biological event, the moment the body stops. That is real, but it is not what interests him. What interests him is Tod, death as a structure of your existence. Not something waiting for you at the end of the road, something that is already here, woven into the fabric of every moment you are alive. You are not a person who will die. You are a person who is dying, who has been dying since the first breath, and whose every choice, every afternoon, every conversation happens inside that fact, whether you acknowledge it or not. Death, for Heidegger, has 4 characteristics, and they are worth sitting with. It is ownmost, the most personal thing that will ever happen to you. No one else's death teaches you anything about yours. It is non-relational. No one can die for you. No one can take your place. At the moment of your death, every relationship you have ever built becomes structurally irrelevant. You go alone. It is certain. Not probably, not likely. Certain. The one fact about your future that requires no hedging. And it is indefinite as to when. You know it will come. You do not know if it will come tonight. Certain, but indefinite. That combination, Heidegger says, is what makes death unlike every other fact in your life. You can plan around a deadline. You cannot plan around a certainty with no date. Now, what happens when you actually let these 4 characteristics land? Not intellectually, not as a list you nod at, but experientially. What happens in the body, in the chest, when you sit in a dark room and let the full weight of certain, indefinite, non-relational ownmost settle? Heidegger says what happens is angst, not fear. He is precise about this. Fear, Furcht, is always about something specific. You fear the diagnosis. You fear the car swerving. You fear the phone call at midnight. Fear has an object. You can name it, face it, sometimes fix it. Angst has no object. Angst is the feeling at 3 in the morning when you wake up and nothing specific is wrong. But the ground beneath your entire life seems to shift. It is not that something threatens you. It is that being itself, the fact that you exist at all, temporarily, without guarantee, becomes suddenly, unbearably vivid. Heidegger uses a German word for this, unheimlich, literally, not being at home. The world you navigate so confidently during the day, your routines, your roles, your sense of who you are, in Angst, all of it becomes strange, unfamiliar, as though you had been living in someone else's house and only just noticed. And here is the part that separates Heidegger from almost every other thinker who has written about dread. He says the 3 a.m. feeling is closer to truth than the comfortable confidence of daylight. The daytime version of you, the one who checks email, makes plans for next month, argues about politics, that version is operating inside das Man, inside the they, inside the machinery that keeps mortality at arm's length. The 3 a.m. version, the one lying in the dark, feeling the floor drop out, that version is seeing something real, something the daylight version is specifically designed to hide. Angst, Heidegger says, is not a problem to be solved. It is a signal to be followed. Follow it where? Heidegger's answer is a phrase that sounds morbid until you understand what he means by it. Vorlaufen zum Tod. Running ahead toward death. Not waiting for death to arrive. Not brooding about it in a morbid spiral. Running ahead, actively, deliberately, with your eyes open, into the full awareness that you will end. Letting that awareness be present, not once as a philosophical exercise, every day, in every choice. He writes, anticipation reveals to Dasein its lostness in the they self and brings it face to face with the possibility of being itself in an impassioned freedom towards death. Strip away the jargon, and what he is saying is this: the moment you truly internalize that your time is finite, not as a slogan on a coffee mug, but as a felt reality in your bones, something shifts. The things you do because one does them, because everyone does them, because it's expected, because it's comfortable, those things lose their grip, and what remains is yours. He has an analogy that I think about often. Imagine walking through a shopping mall on autopilot. You drift from store to store. You pick things up, put them down. You're not really choosing anything. You're just moving through the space the way the space was designed to move you. Now, imagine someone taps you on the shoulder and says, "You have exactly $100, and it's all you will ever have." Suddenly, the drifting stops. Every object on every shelf becomes a real question. Is this worth it? Is this what I want to spend my finite resources on? The scarcity doesn't limit you. It clarifies you. It makes you, perhaps for the first time, someone who is actually choosing. That is what Heidegger calls Entschlossenheit, resoluteness, not grim determination, not clenched jaw stoicism, a kind of waking up inside your own life, seeing that you have been drifting in das Man's current, and choosing, with open eyes, to swim. There is something I need to say here, because honesty demands it, and because this is a channel that does not look away from uncomfortable truths. Martin Heidegger joined the Nazi Party in 1933. He served as rector of the University of Freiburg. He implemented Nazi policies. He wore a swastika pin when meeting a former student in Rome in 1936. His private notebooks, published after his death, contain anti-Semitic passages, and after the war, he maintained a near-total silence about the Holocaust. A man who wrote more profoundly about authenticity than perhaps any philosopher in history failed spectacularly at it in his own life. That is a tension worth contemplating, not resolving, contemplating. His insight about death stands on its own, the way a mathematical proof stands on its own, regardless of the mathematician's character. But the gap between what he saw and how he lived is itself a kind of evidence. Evidence that seeing clearly is not the same as being transformed by what you see. That intellectual confrontation with mortality, however rigorous, may not be enough. The Buddha, as we are about to discover, would agree. But so here is where Heidegger leaves us. Face your death. Let it produce angst. Follow the angst, not away, but through. Let it strip away the anonymous, borrowed life of das Man. And in that clearing, find yourself, your own most self. The self that was always there, buried under the noise of the they. It is a powerful vision. It has changed lives. It deserves to be taken seriously. But there is a question Heidegger never asks, a question that once you hear it, you cannot unhear. What if the self you find at the edge of death is not what you think it is? What if the whole project of owning your death, of using mortality to sharpen the self into its truest form, is built on an assumption that does not survive close examination? What if there is no owner? The Buddha sat with death longer than Heidegger, closer than Heidegger, and he came back with a very different report. The Buddha's answer: see through the one who dies. Let's go back to where we started. The Buddha, the monks. The question: how do you contemplate death? We heard the answers. We heard the verdict. But we moved through it quickly, the way a hook must. Now let's stay, because there is something in that teaching that we missed the first time. Something about why the Buddha set the bar so impossibly high. Think about what the monks actually said. I might die within a day. That is not a casual answer. Most people on this planet do not contemplate their death within a year. A monk who sits with the possibility of dying today is already far beyond what ordinary life demands. And the Buddha said, heedless, loose, not enough. Even 4 morsels of food, even a man who considers that he may not finish the meal in front of him. The Buddha says, you are still living with too much slack. Why? Because the purpose is not morbid precision. The purpose, the Buddha's exact words, is for the sake of ending the effluence. The effluence, greed, sensual desire, becoming, ignorance. The leaks in the mind that keep suffering cycling. The contemplation of death is not about death. It is about what death does to the mind that truly faces it. And the mind that says, I might die today, still has a cushion. Still has a day's worth of plans between itself and the abyss. The mind that says, I might die between this breath and the next. That mind has nowhere to hide. And a mind with nowhere to hide begins to let go of the things it has been gripping. That is not Heidegger's resoluteness. That is something else. Something we need a different word for. But here is where the Buddha does something that Heidegger never does. In a companion teaching, the Buddha tells his monks, every evening, ask yourself, are there any evil, unskillful qualities unabandoned in me that would be an obstruction were I to die tonight? If the answer is yes, if there is greed or hatred or confusion you have not yet faced, then practice as if one's turban or head were on fire. Urgency, total urgency. But, and this is the turn, if the answer is no, if you have done the work, if you have faced what needed facing, then, the Buddha says, you dwell in joy and rapture. Joy, not grim acceptance, not stoic composure, not the tight-lipped resoluteness of a philosopher squaring up to the void. Joy, because the person who has genuinely confronted death and cleared away the debris, that person has nothing left to lose. And a person with nothing left to lose is, paradoxically, the most joyful person in the room. Heidegger gets you to resoluteness. The Buddha gets you to rapture. And the distance between those two destinations is the distance between this entire conversation. Which brings us to a comparison that, as far as I can find, no scholar has published directly. Tonight, we are going to make it ourselves. Is Heidegger's Angst the same as what the Buddha calls dukkha? Is it suffering? Is it the second arrow? The Buddha taught that when something painful happens, a loss, an illness, the reality of death, that is the first arrow, unavoidable. It strikes everyone. But then there is a second arrow, the grief about the grief, the anxiety about the anxiety, the story you tell yourself about the pain. That second arrow, the reactive compounding layer, is optional, and most of the Buddha's path is about learning not to fire it. So, is Angst a second arrow? I don't think so. And this matters. Angst, the way Heidegger describes it, is not a reaction to death. It is not a layer added on top of the reality. It is the direct encounter with the reality itself. The 3 a.m. feeling is not you worrying about death. It is you touching the fact of death, without the buffer of das Man, without the cushion of one dies. That makes angst much closer to something the Buddhist tradition calls Saṁvega. Saṁvega is a Pali word that has no clean English translation. The great translator and teacher, Thanissaro Bhikkhu, describes it as an oppressive sense of shock, dismay, and alienation that comes with realizing the futility of life as normally lived. A chastening sense of one's own complicity and foolishness, and an anxious sense of urgency. Read that again slowly. Shock, dismay, alienation. The futility of life as normally lived. One's own complicity. That is angst. Almost exactly. The ground shifting, the comfort dissolving. The sudden, nauseating clarity that you have been living someone else's life, or no one's life at all. But here is the difference, and it is not a small one. In the Buddhist tradition, Saṁvega is never left alone. It is always paired with a second movement, passada, clarity, serene confidence. The sense that, yes, ordinary life is futile, yes, you have been asleep, yes, death is coming, and there is a path. Thanissaro puts it simply, passada is what keeps Saṁvega from turning into despair. The architecture is, Saṁvega arises. You see the truth of impermanence, suffering, the hollowness of heedless living. And then passada arises, because the very tradition that showed you the disease also shows you the cure. There is a practice, there is a path. There is, the Buddha says, the deathless. Heidegger has Saṁvega. Heidegger does not have passada. His architecture is, angst arises, you face the abyss, and you become resolute. You own your finitude. You live authentically within the time you have. And that is where it ends. There is no path beyond finitude. There is no deathless. There is only the honest, unflinching life of a being who knows it will end and refuses to look away. That is noble. It may also be incomplete. Because the Buddha did not only teach about death, he died. And the way he died, and the way his closest disciple responded to that death, is one of the most extraordinary narratives in any religious tradition. The text is the Mahaparinibbana Sutta, the great discourse on the final passing. It is long, detailed, and full of moments that deserve more attention than they usually receive. Here is one. 3 times, 3 separate times, the Buddha hinted to Ānanda, his attendant and closest companion for 25 years, that a Tathagata could, if asked, extend his lifespan to the end of the age. 3 times the hint went unheard. The text says Ānanda's mind was as though influenced by Mara, as though something prevented him from hearing what was being offered. He did not ask. The Buddha relinquished his will to live, and when Ānanda finally understood what had happened, when he realized the hints he had missed, he begged the Buddha to stay. Too late. The fault is yours, Ānanda. That scene, the closest disciple, the man who had spent a quarter century at the Buddha's side, unable to hear the offer that would have postponed death, is a portrait of pamada so intimate it hurts. This is not a stranger on the street avoiding the subject of mortality. This is the man who loved the Buddha most, standing right next to him and still not being able to face what was coming. Das Man reaches even the inner circle. Later, after the Buddha had fallen ill, after he had described his body as an old cart held together with much difficulty, Ānanda went to a doorpost and wept. "Here I am, still in training," he said, "and the teacher is about to pass away, the teacher who has shown me such compassion." The Buddha sent for him and said, Haven't I already taught you the state of growing different, separated from all things dear and appealing? That is contemplation number 4, from the 5 daily contemplations. The teaching we heard earlier tonight, the Buddha on his deathbed, pointing his closest friend back to the most basic practice, the one Ānanda knew by heart but had not yet let into his bones, and then the death itself. The Buddha entered the meditative absorptions, ascending through all 9 jhanas, descending back, ascending again to the 4th jhana, and there, in the 4th jhana, he passed. Trees bloomed out of season, the earth trembled. Those monks who were free from passion observed, "Fabrications are inconstant. What else is there to expect?" Those who still had attachment, they tore their hair. They rolled on the ground. 2 responses, same event. The difference, how deeply death had been understood before it arrived. And the Buddha's very last words, the last sentence spoken by a man who had spent 45 years teaching, were these: Vayadhamma Sankara, Apamadena Sampadetha. All fabrications are subject to decay, bring about completion through heedfulness. The last word, apamadena, heedfulness. The opposite of pamada, the opposite of the disease we named at the beginning of this conversation. The word from Dhammapada 21. Heedfulness is the path to the deathless. From the most famous verse of his teaching to the last breath of his life, the same word. The thread that holds the entire 45 years together. And there is one more story, and it is the one that makes everything we've said tonight feel small. Her name was Patakara. She lost her husband to a snake bite. She lost one child to a hawk, snatched while she was crossing a river. She lost the other child to the river's current. And when she reached her parents' village, the only family she had left, she learned that the house had collapsed in a storm, killing her parents and her brother. All of it within days. She went insane. She wandered, half naked, through the streets. People threw garbage at her. She was, by any measure, a person destroyed by death, the person for whom death had taken everything, left nothing. The Buddha saw her. He restored her sanity with a single word. "Sister, recover your presence of mind." He did not console her. He did not explain suffering. He taught her impermanence, directly, precisely, as fact, not philosophy. And Patakara practiced. And one evening, watching water flow downhill after washing her feet, watching how the streams ran shorter and longer down the slope, she saw it, impermanence, not as a teaching, as the structure of reality itself. She pulled the wick of her oil lamp with a pin, and as the flame went out, liberation. Her own words, like the flame's unbinding, was the liberation of awareness. A woman who lost everything to death found freedom by looking at water running down a hillside. That is what the Buddha means by see through the one who dies. Not a concept, not a theory. The direct perception that what you thought was a fixed self, the self that owned the husband, the children, the parents, the grief, was a process, a flow, like water down a slope, like a flame that was never a thing, only a burning. Heidegger says, face your death, and you will find your own most self, the self that is finally, truly yours. The Buddha says, face your death, and you will find that there was never an owner, that the ownmost was another layer of the dream. Heidegger gets you to the edge of the cliff. The Buddha asks you to jump, and discovers that there was never solid ground to begin with, not beneath your feet, not beneath anyone's. Coda. There was once a teacher named Araka, long before the Buddha, long before Heidegger, long before any of us. Araka taught his students that life is brief, and he used 7 images. A dewdrop on a blade of grass vanishes at sunrise. A bubble on water forms and is already breaking. A line drawn in water, gone before the finger lifts. A mountain stream never pauses, never stands still, never the same river twice. A glob of spit on the tongue. How long before it's gone? A piece of meat thrown on a hot iron pan. It was never going to last. And the last image, the one that stays with me, a cow being led to slaughter. Every step she takes brings her closer. She does not need to know the destination for the destination to be real. The Buddha tells his monks, Araka taught this when the human lifespan was 60,000 years. If life was short, then how much shorter now? 7 images, no argument, no philosophy, just the world, held up like a mirror, showing you what you already know, but have arranged your entire life around not feeling. So here we are. 2 men looked at the same fact. You will die, and you do not know when, and built 2 of the most profound responses in the history of human thought. Neither of them offers comfort. If you came here tonight looking for reassurance, for the warm idea that death is just a transition, or nothing to fear, or part of God's plan, neither Heidegger nor the Buddha will give you that. Both of them would say that comfort is a version of the disease. What they offer instead is clarity. Heidegger says, own your death. Let the certainty of your ending burn away the anonymous life you have been borrowing from the they. Become, perhaps for the first time, the person who is actually choosing, actually present, actually here. Your death is the most personal thing you have. Use it, the Buddha says. Look more carefully. The one who owns the death, the one who wants to become more real, more authentic, more themselves at the edge of the abyss. Look at that one. What do you find? 5 aggregates, a process, a river that calls itself a lake. When you truly see this, not as theory, but as Patakara saw water flowing downhill, the grip releases. Not because you have steeled yourself against death, because you have seen through the one who was gripping. One strengthens the self at death's edge. The other sees through it. I am not going to tell you which one is right. That is not what this conversation is for. But I will tell you this. The philosopher Nishitani, who studied under Heidegger in Freiburg, and then returned to Japan and spent the rest of his life in the Zen tradition, described 3 fields of existence. The first is ordinary consciousness, the default, the autopilot, the life of das Man and Pamada. The second is what he called the field of nihility, Heidegger's territory. The self confronts nothingness, angst, resoluteness, the honest, unflinching life of a being who will end. The third field, the one Nishitani believed Heidegger pointed toward but never entered, is shunyata, emptiness, not the emptiness of a void, the emptiness of a hand that has finally stopped grasping. Heidegger opens the door. Buddhism walks through. The Buddha died in the 4th jhana with his last word on his lips, apamadina, heedfulness, the same word from Dhammapada 21, the verse we heard at the beginning of tonight. Heedfulness is the path to the deathless. Heedlessness is the path to death. From the most famous teaching of his life to the last syllable of his death, one word, one thread. Heidegger died in 1976. He was 86 years old. He was buried in Meskirk, the village where he was born, beside his parents. His gravestone bears a solitary star, two lives, two deaths. One question that does not go away when you close this video. The breath you are taking right now, you don't know if there will be another. Heidegger would say, "Let that terrify you into living." The Buddha would say, "Let that free you from pretending you ever had a life to lose."